She was 30 feet into the hillside before anyone in the settlement took what she was doing seriously, and by then it was September 12th, 1891, and the aspens on the upper ridge had already gone gold. The digging had taken 11 weeks. Her hands had gone from blistered to calloused, to something past calloused, a dense, insensate armoring of the palms that she noticed only when she tried to thread a needle by lamplight and found she couldn't feel the eye of it anymore. The tunnel smelled of wet clay and pine root, and something else beneath those, something older, the particular mineral cold of undisturbed earth that has not seen air since before any living person was born. Her name was Britta Carlson, and she was 37 years old, and she had been digging since the last week of June. She had arrived in the Clearwater Valley of northern Idaho Territory 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1888, with her 16-year-old son, Mikhail, $400 in banknotes sewn into the hem of a wool skirt, and a surveyor's map she had purchased in Spokane Falls that showed a parcel of timbered slopeland on the valley's eastern rise. Her husband, Gustav, had died of a burst appendix in 1885, leaving her with the boy, the house in Minnesota, and a life insurance settlement that was small enough to feel like an afterthought, but large enough, if she was careful, to start something new somewhere that land still cost what land used to cost. She filed on 160 acres and built a one-room cabin that first summer using timber she and Mikhail felled from the property's lower stand. The cabin was adequate. Adequate was the word she used for it privately, meaning it will do until something better is possible. What she had come from was, in one specific way, relevant to everything that followed. Britta had grown up in Hälsingland, the forested province of east-central Sweden, in a family of small-scale farmers and loggers who had been working the same hillside land for 4 generations. Her maternal grandfather, a compact, deliberate man named Arvid, whom she had known until she was 12, had been the keeper of the family's bergkellari, the hill cellar, carved directly into the granite shoulder of the slope behind the farmhouse, a tradition in Hälsingland that went back centuries, and whose logic was so embedded in how her family thought about winter that it had never required explanation. You put your stores in the hill kept them. That was the arrangement. What the hill offered was constant temperature and constant humidity. Not warm exactly, but a steady 38 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether it was August or February outside, because the rock and the packed earth around the tunnel absorbed and released heat so slowly that seasonal variation simply failed to reach it. A bergkellari of sufficient depth was immune to winter, also to summer. It was a pocket of perpetual autumn, perfect for root vegetables, cured meats, fermented goods, and, this was the part that was particular to her family's practice, pre-seasoned firewood that had been cut 2 or 3 years in advance and stored dry in the hill while its replacement was aging in the open air. 2 years' supply, always 2 years. That had been Arvid's rule, repeated so often it had become a kind of liturgy. You never burn this year's wood. This year's wood is next year's wood. Next year's wood is the year after's. You always burn wood that has had 2 summers to dry. The Clearwater Valley didn't have this tradition. It had the other tradition, cut in the fall, burn in the winter, repeat, which worked most years well enough. It had worked for the Nez Perce people who had used the valley for generations, who burned dry fallen wood and selected their fuel with a practiced eye that amounted to centuries of accumulated knowledge about what grew where and dried how fast. It had worked for the first wave of settlers who arrived in the mid-1880s, most of whom had come from the Midwest and brought Midwestern wood practices with them. Cut, split, stack, burn, year to year. Britta looked at the hillside behind her cabin in the spring of 1891 and decided that adequate was no longer sufficient. The winter of 1889 to 1890 had been the pivot point. It was not the worst winter she had experienced. The winters of her Swedish childhood could match anything Idaho had offered her. But it was a winter during which she had come very close to running out of fuel. And coming very close is, in certain conditions, close enough to the thing itself to change how you think permanently. She had burned through 3 cords by February 15th and had only 1.5 remaining. The cold that year held through mid-March. She had made it through on rationing, 1 fire per day in the evening, and otherwise wearing everything she owned in layers through the daylight hours while she worked. Mikael, by then 19 and increasingly capable, had spent 3 days in late February cutting green timber in the snow and dragging it home to dry beside the stove, which is not a method anyone who knew what they were doing would recommend, but which is what you do when the alternative is freezing. She vowed that winter that she would not come close again. The calculation she worked out over the spring of 1891 was methodical. A cold Idaho winter, genuine cold, not a mild one, required between 4 and 5 cords of properly seasoned firewood for a 1-room cabin with a single stove, accounting for cooking as well as heating. Call it 4.5 cords to be conservative, which is the direction safety lies. 2 winters' supply, therefore, was 9 cords minimum. 9 cords of split, seasoned hardwood. She intended to use primarily tamarack and Douglas fir, both of which grew in abundance on the property, and both of which dried to excellent fuel, required roughly 18 months of open-air seasoning to reach the moisture content at which they burned efficiently. Call it 2 summers to be safe, which is the direction Arvid had always pointed. 9 cords stored dry, protected from rain and snow and the freeze-thaw cycling that was the primary enemy of outdoor stacked wood. In northern Idaho, where the annual snowfall at her elevation averaged 68 inches and where spring melt could run persistent and sideways for 6 weeks, a standard open-air woodpile, however well covered, spent a meaningful fraction of every winter absorbing moisture from the ground up and the snow in. Even bark-covered stacks lost efficiency to ground moisture wicking through the bottom row. She needed something that would hold 9 cords at a stable temperature and 0 moisture intrusion. She had grown up inside exactly that thing. The hill behind her cabin was 40 feet of dense clay loam over a granite shelf, stable, dry, and already holding at roughly 40 degrees Fahrenheit, based on the 1 test hole she had dug in April, to a depth of 3 feet, which had smelled exactly like Arvid's Bergkellera and felt on her bare forearm when she plunged it in, like an October afternoon. She began digging on June 23, 1891. Mikael helped on days when he wasn't working his own land. He had filed on an adjacent parcel the previous year and was building his own place, which was 3 or 4 days per week. The rest, she did herself. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and 6 feet high at the entrance, tapering slightly as it went deeper to follow the line of the granite shelf. She used a pick for the initial breaking, a short-handled spade for the clearing, and a wooden barrow she had built specifically for the job to haul the spoil out to the slope below, where she piled it methodically against the downhill side of the cabin for additional insulation. Nothing wasted. The spoil pile grew into a low earthen berm that, by September, was redirecting runoff away from the cabin's foundation, an unplanned benefit that she noted in her journal with the mild satisfaction of someone who finds that a good idea, correctly executed, tends to generate additional good ideas. The first person to say anything direct about the project was Henrik Dahl, age 49, the settlement's nearest neighbor, and a man who had homesteaded in the Clearwater Valley since 1883. 8 years, which was longer than almost anyone else in the immediate area. He was experienced, self-reliant, and had opinions about most things that were rooted in genuine observation rather than pure convention. He was also, as a practical matter, Britta's primary source of comparison when it came to how things were done in the valley, which meant his skepticism carried actual weight. He rode up on a warm July afternoon when she was approximately 20 feet into the hill and found her standing in the tunnel entrance covered in clay dust, drinking water from a tin cup. "Cellar?" he asked. "Cellar," she said. He looked at the tunnel dimensions, the spoil pile, the angle of entry. Slightly downward, she had designed it to run parallel to the slope rather than horizontally, which meant the floor of the tunnel descended about 3 inches for every 10 feet of depth, keeping groundwater from pooling inside. "That's going to collapse," he said, meaning the ceiling. He had experience with underground structures. He had a conventional root cellar dug vertically behind his own barn, the kind you entered from above through a trap door, with wood frame walls and a board ceiling. He knew what inadequately supported underground ceilings did. You need cribbing in there. He was right about cribbing. She showed him the cribbing she had already installed. Rough-sawn fir planks notched and set every 4 feet along the tunnel's length, braced against the walls, carrying the ceiling load. Not as thorough as a full timber frame, but sufficient for clay loam soil over solid granite. The granite was the key. 3 feet above the tunnel ceiling was bedrock. Bedrock does not collapse. Dahl looked at the crib work for a while. He didn't retract the concern. He requalified it. "If that granite shelf holds consistent," he said. "It does," Britta said. She had tested it at 4 points along the line. He rode home without further comment, which in his particular vocabulary meant that his objection had been adequately answered. The second voice of skepticism came from a woman named Agnes Portman, age 35, the wife of the settlement's part-time preacher, and a person whose social function was something like a community barometer. What Agnes thought tended to be what most people were privately thinking, and she had the useful quality of saying it directly. She arrived on a Wednesday in early August with a pot of preserved plums and an expression of earnest concern. "Mikhail says you're putting your firewood underground," Agnes said, setting the plums on the table. "In the hill," Britta said. "Not underground exactly." "Wood rots in the ground," Agnes said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of everything she knew about wood and earth in proximity, which was accurate as far as it went. Wood in soil contact, wood in high humidity, wood without airflow. These things rot. She had seen it. Everyone in the settlement had seen it. Britta explained the ventilation system she had designed into the tunnel. 2 vertical shafts, each 4 inches in diameter, bored at angles through the hill above the tunnel line and capped with inverted tin cones to shed rain. The shafts created a passive draft. Warm air from the tunnel's interior rose through the upper shaft, drawing in cooler outside air through the lower one. Not a powerful circulation, but sufficient to prevent the stagnant, humidity-saturated environment that encouraged rot. The wood inside the tunnel would be stacked on raised rails, 2x4 fear sleepers set on stone footings, keeping every piece 6 inches off the floor, and would be racked with gaps between splits for continued airflow. Agnes listened to this carefully. She was not a woman who dismissed technical explanations. "What if your shafts ice over in January?" she asked. It was the right question. Britta had thought about it. The shafts were positioned so that prevailing winter winds would push across them rather than directly into them, creating a slight negative pressure that would pull rather than block. She had also lined the upper 12 inches of each shaft with tin, which conducted enough ambient heat from the interior to prevent ice formation, except in extreme cold, in which case the tunnel's internal temperature would drop toward freezing anyway, and the ventilation need would be reduced. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was an adequate one. And adequate, she had decided, was sufficient for ventilation shafts in a firewood store, even if it was not sufficient for the cabin they served. Agnes took her plums home and did not raise the subject again in public, which was its own kind of endorsement. The third skeptic was Mikhail himself, not hostile, but honest in the way that children are honest with parents when they're old enough to disagree, but still young enough to do it carefully. He was 20 years old and strong from 2 years of homestead work, and he had spent enough time in the tunnel to have developed specific doubts about the timeline. "It'll take 3 years to fill," he told his mother in August. "You planned for 2 summers of cutting, but you're already behind this season. You won't have 9 cords by October." He was correct. She was behind. The tunnel work had consumed most of June and July, and the cutting she had planned for those months had been partially deferred. Her current estimate, revised from the summer's actual output, was that she would have 5.5 cords stored and seasoned by mid-October. Not 9, not 2 winters. 1.5, perhaps, if the winter was moderate. The gap between what she'd planned and what she had was 4 cords. 4 cords at her current late-season cutting rate. The forest was accessible. The timber was standing. The wood was there. Was approximately 6 weeks of concentrated work. 6 weeks was what remained before first frost. She did the arithmetic precisely. 4 cords of split fir at approximately 45 minutes per cord for bucking and 30 minutes per cord for splitting with her heavy maul was roughly 10 days of full effort on the wood alone, not counting hauling and stacking. Mikhail could give her 4 days. She could give herself 10. That was 14 days of actual labor available before the weather turned consistently. 14 days was enough, but only if everything else stopped. Everything else stopped. These are the accounts that rarely surface in any formal record, and I think they deserve better than obscurity. If this story is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history find the people who care about it. She cut from first light to the point where the saw arm failed. Not exhaustion exactly, but the specific state where the accuracy of each stroke degraded enough to become dangerous. Then she rested 1 hour and did it again. Mikhail came for 4 of those days in a row, and they worked in tandem, one on each end of the crosscut saw, trading the pace-setting position every 20 minutes as arms tired. By September 5th, they had 8 cords cut and split. By September 12th, the day the aspens went gold on the upper ridge, they had 9.5 cords in the tunnel. Stacked on the rail sleepers, racked for airflow, the tunnel cool and dark around them, smelling of fresh-cut fir resin and the older mineral cold underneath. 9.5 cords. Enough for 2 winters. She walked out of the tunnel on September 12th and stood on the slope below the entrance for a while without doing anything. The aspens were gold in the late afternoon light. Her arms ached from the shoulder joint to the wrist in a way that suggested she had used muscles that had not previously been consulted. The tunnel entrance behind her was framed in the rough fir boarding she had installed as a door surround, and through it came a faint breath of cold air. The hill exhaling its stored autumn into the afternoon. She went inside and wrote in her journal, 9.5 cords. Tunnel sealed. The hill has it now. The winter of 1891 to 1892 arrived early and stayed long. The first hard freeze came October 14th, 6 days earlier than the valley's rough average, and by November 20th, the temperature had settled into the single digits and remained there, with brief and grudging exceptions, through February 28th. The total snowfall for the valley that winter was measured later by a surveyor's party passing through in April at 81 inches, 13 inches above the previous record for the decade. Henrik Dahl's wood supply, which he estimated at 6 cords at the start of winter, ran to January 31st. He was a careful man with a careful stove and a well-chinked cabin, and 6 cords in a normal winter would have carried him through March. This was not a normal winter. He spent February burning the lumber he had stockpiled for a planned barn extension, which was a decision that cost him a summer's worth of work and a year's worth of plans, but was preferable to the alternative. Agnes Portman's family burned their entire supply by February 10th and spent the final 6 weeks of winter in consolidated survival mode, 3 families sharing the Portman cabin by mutual and wordless agreement, pooling their remaining fuel. It worked. They came through. But the margin was the kind that changes how you plan for the rest of your life. Britta's tunnel provided 4 1/4 cords for the 1891 to 1892 winter. She tracked every load she withdrew in her journal: date, approximate quantity, running total. The winter's end on March 15, 1892, found her with 5 1/4 cords remaining. 5 1/4 cords. Enough fuel for the following winter without cutting a single additional piece. She did cut more anyway. That was the point. Henrik Dahl came to see the tunnel in April, when the snow had melted enough to make the approach walkable. He stood in the entrance for a while, letting his eyes adjust to the cool dimness inside, and then walked the full length of it. 30 feet. The Fear crib work at regular intervals, the vent shafts casting pale circles of light on the floor, the remaining wood stacked on its sleepers in ranks that were, after a full winter of withdrawal and management, still nearly 5 cords deep. He said very little. He was not a man of many words when many words weren't needed. He looked at the ventilation shafts and the rail system, and the downward floor pitch that had kept groundwater from collecting at the inner end. And he asked 2 or 3 specific construction questions: dimensions, materials, the angle of the vent shaft boring. He wrote the answers in a small notebook he carried. "Your grandfather built these in Sweden," he said at the entrance on his way out. "My grandfather's grandfather," Britta said, "and before him." Dahl nodded. He rode home and spent that April and May building a version of the tunnel in the hillside behind his own barn. His tunnel was slightly wider than Britta's, 5 feet instead of 4, and he incorporated a modification she hadn't used: a secondary interior chamber at the far end, separated from the wood storage area by a board partition for root vegetable storage. The constant 40-degree temperature was ideal for potatoes, carrots, and turnips, and the separation prevented the volatile compounds from curing vegetables from affecting the wood's flavor, which would have mattered very little for firewood, but would matter considerably if the design were ever used for smoking or aging food. The modification was a genuine improvement. Britta acknowledged this directly. By the summer of 1893, there were 4 hill tunnels in the Clearwater Valley settlement. By 1897, there were 9. The spread was not coordinated. It was the natural propagation of a good idea in a community where the evidence of that idea's value was visible and survived through and impossible to argue with once you had spent a February burning barn lumber. Britta Carlson lived on that property until 1924, when she was 70 years old, and her granddaughter Elin, Mikael's eldest, had taken over the daily management of the homestead. In her final years, by which time the original tunnel had been extended to 42 feet and held upward of 12 cords in its main chamber, plus a substantial root vegetable store in the partitioned inner room, she was occasionally asked by newer settlers about the construction. She explained it with the same patient completeness she had used in 1891, because the questions were always the same and they were always the right questions. The last recorded account of anyone entering the tunnel is from 1961, a letter written by Elin's son, a man then in his late 50s, to a cousin in Seattle. He described it as being in excellent condition despite 70 years of use. The crib work at the entrance had been replaced twice, but the deeper supports were original. The granite shelf above had not shifted. The temperature inside, he noted with mild wonder, was 39 degrees on a July afternoon when the outdoor temperature was 81. If you followed this account all the way to its end, and there aren't many people who do, and I'm genuinely glad you're one of them, please take a second to hit that like button. These stories exist on the edge of being forgotten, and your engagement is what keeps them alive. The hill cellar is not a Scandinavian invention, though Scandinavia refined it to a high degree over many centuries. Across the mountain cultures of Central Europe, Switzerland, Austria, the Tyrol, hillside storage chambers carved into stable slopes appear as far back as the early medieval period, used for wine, dairy, grain, and the carefully timed rotation of fuel stocks. In Japan, the Yamadera tradition, literally mountain cellar, produced similar carved chambers in the hillsides of rural Tohoku, where the stable temperature preserved miso and pickled vegetables through extremes of both summer heat and winter cold. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved storage chambers into cliff faces partly for this same thermal stability, not only for defensibility, as is commonly emphasized, but because sandstone at sufficient depth holds a near-constant temperature that protects stored goods from the desert's extreme swings between scorching days and freezing nights. The problem the Pueblo builders were solving was the same one Britta's grandfather had solved in Hälsingland. The problem of maintaining, in a hostile climate, a small pocket of stability into which you could deposit the surplus of one season and withdraw it reliably in another. The logic is simple enough to state in one sentence, which is perhaps why it disappears so easily into the background of history. If you cannot trust the outside world to hold your supplies at a safe temperature, you carve yourself a piece of the inside world that can. Every version of this idea, in every culture that independently arrived at it, is a version of the same negotiation, a conversation between people who needed to survive, and a landscape that, properly questioned, offered more than it appeared to. The hill behind Britta Carlson's cabin was not, from the outside, remarkable, 40 feet of clay loam over granite, but she had grown up in a family that knew what questions to ask of a hillside, and the hill had answered. 39 degrees in July, 5 1/4 cords in March, 2 winters, stored. The hill had answered completely.